Hello, and welcome to Day 2 of Teaching Immigration Across the Curriculum. My name is Phitsamay Uy, and I'm an assistant professor at UMass Lowell in the Graduate School of Education. Today, I will talk to you about promoting success of immigrant students by integrating students' lives into your curriculum. First, I will provide a context of the immigrant learning that you've been learning about with the Day 1 speakers. Secondly, I will present a theoretical framework around culturally responsive teaching. I will use the Legacies of War curriculum that I developed in integrating students' lives into the curriculum to show you a live example of how it's conducted. Then I will present you some guiding questions to consider as you think about how you would do this work in your own classroom. Throughout using the theoretical framework, you'll be also developing relationships with your students and building community. So hopefully you're all excited and we can begin our presentation. So this past couple of days, you've been introduced to the immigration of here in the United States within the context of the Latino, the Asian, and the African immigrants. And so you know that 1 in 5 children in the United States are children of immigrants, if not immigrants themselves. And immigration touches all 50 states, and the predominance of the immigrants are coming from Asia and Latin America. As told by the students, the language barriers are very difficult for them in terms of their learning and building a sense of community and connection with other people. But it's also compounded by linguistic isolation. If they live in communities like your Chinatowns where everyone speaks Chinese, but when they go to school, that is where English is the primary language being used. You listened to Michael Sadowski's webcast yesterday about from successful immigrant students, and they talked about the poverty and other high-risk factors that they have that contributes to their dropout rate. So you know that there are cultural differences, and so a few of them that I want to highlight is the learning styles and the focus. In most mainstream U.S. classrooms, the learning style is focused on individual effort and meritocracy. For some of the immigrants, they come from a culture where it focuses on cooperative learning. So teaching kids to really understand what's expected of them in the United States, but also connecting to what they already knew coming from their home country or home heritage is an important aspect of what you do as a teacher. Likewise, what you use for encouragement might be different for some of the immigrant students who have been in communities where critique is the way of reinforcement. Whereas here in the U.S., we use a lot of positive affirmation. And so teaching students how to accept critique and also using positive affirmation to build their sense of self-esteem is also part of your role as a teacher. Another difference for immigrant students in the classroom is the direction towards being youth-centered and asking youth about what they want and need. And they're used to coming from homes where it's very adult-centered, respecting the authority and the elders and having the elders dictate. And so that is a new reorientation that you would also have to model for your students. One other thing that is also different for immigrant students in the U.S. is here in America, people talk about the melting pot and how a lot of teachers use a colorblind where I don't see the student's color or race or ethnicity, where students come from very strong ethnic identity development. And for them, whether it's being Somali or Haitian Creole or Khmer or Lao, is very much important a part of who they are. And so when teachers don't see that and don't connect with that, they are really not able to help the students connect their learning with their own lives. So the framework that we're introducing you is actually based on the principles of culturally responsive teaching. And in culturally responsive teaching, we have an emphasis and the focus on the role of culture. The culture plays a central role in students' identity as well as to their learning. It helps shape communication styles and the receival of information, as well as it helps influence the thinking process of individuals and groups. So when you're using culturally responsive teaching, what you are doing is recognizing the importance of including students' cultural references in all aspects of learning. And this is a concept that Gloria Lasson-Billings has introduced in her book, The Dream Keepers. Of culturally responsive teaching, there are many characteristics: positive perspectives on parents and families, communication of high expectations, learning within the context of the culture, having student-centered instruction, having culturally mediated instruction, reshaping the curriculum, and focusing on teacher as the facilitator. In the short time that we have together, I'll be focusing on reshaping the curriculum. So in adapting curriculum, that is the primary responsibilities of educators. You know your content, and your job is to help the students learn your content. But in order for you to do that effectively with immigrant students, you have to get to know your students. And so you really have to adopt an inquiry stance, and really empathetic lens of who are my students, where are they coming from, and what is it that I need to know about them so I can make this learning in my classroom more meaningful. So some guiding questions for you to consider as you are looking about reshaping and adapting your curriculum is, first, which organizational strategies do I use? Do I purely do whole class instruction? Are there individual students that I focus on? Do I do any groupings or promote any peer partnerships? Those are the questions when you're looking at your curriculum. Highlight how the information is being shared. Second, which instructional strategies do I use? Do you incorporate cooperative learning and group projects? Is there an independent study option for students who are much more introverted but would also like to expand their learning from what you are currently teaching? How much of the writing process are you incorporating? And any other instructional strategies if you're in math or the sciences that you use. Then you consider which instructional skills do you use. Is there any brainstorming or questioning or informing or discussing? Do you do a lot of demonstrating or having students observe or you observe, responding and explaining to each other? What sort of things, what are the teaching practices that you use for each of your content area? Then we want you to consider which strategies do you use to assess student learning. Is it all written tests, summative tests at the end of a chapter? Do you include work samples or structured observations? Or do you include oral tests, interviews, performance tasks? Are there open-ended questions? And do you have students assessing each other in their cooperative groups when they work together? Then, how do the students themselves assess their own learning? Do they just do it through tests? Do the students report out on their learning? Or are you keeping reflective journals as part of your science labs, your history chapters? Is there any self-evaluation or rubrics that they hand in with each of their outcomes or assessment pieces? And how do they assess their own learning when they're working together in groups? So as you look at your curriculum and look at what you're using in terms of your organizational strategies and your instructional strategies and who the students are in your classroom, you need to consider how does the cultural component fit with each lesson. Do you clearly state connections between the content and the students? A lot of times students will say, why do I need to learn this? It's the so what. What is important about what you're teaching and why does it make a difference in the students' lives? Have you also considered how your lesson could be perceived by immigrant students? So you know your content really well and you're well versed with all, but you need to switch with the students and say, what is it that they're going to get out of this? What are the 2 or 3 takeaway messages of each lesson, and how would they be understood by the immigrant students themselves based on what you know about their background? Also, we want you to consider how have you engaged with the content. Is it just a stand-in delivery model? Are there different ways? Are there videos you can use? Dramatic retells or plays or anything that can bring the content alive for immigrant students who struggle with the language component. So in these aspects, you also have to allow for cultural differences in the presentation and participation of the lesson. So when you are looking at students who come from an oral background, do you accommodate them by having them demonstrate their learning through an oral presentation? For your artistic students, can they reenact, do a artistic performance to show their mastery as opposed to just a paper and pencil test? Do you utilize portfolio strategy where you can actually show works in progress as well as completed pieces? So if you're in writing or in a science lab, is it just only the finished science lab, or are they drawing and articulating and working in partners, co-writing science lab papers as opposed to just a singular piece of finished work? And then also, are there other considerations like community traditions of understanding and mastery that you can learn about that could also be utilized in your classroom? So some ways that you could vary your teaching strategies to help immigrant students better understand your content is using cooperative learning, especially for materials that are new to students. They need to be able to engage with the materials with classmates and have them think through about what they think this new content is. With that being said, you should also assign independent work for students after they're familiar with the concept, and that is their extension. This is what I've just learned now. What else can I apply this to? You could also use role-playing strategies. Sometimes while you're modeling, you could also have other students co-modeling within other smaller groups. You could also assign student research projects that focus on issues that apply to their own community or cultural background. If you are a U.S. history teacher talking about race and conflict, you can also ask them to consider what are the different racial conflicts that are happening in the Congolese or Iran or Iraq. Likewise, you could provide various options for completing an assignment. The more the students have a choice about how they show their learning, and the more that you're open to having these options for them, there are various ways that students can connect with you as opposed to just a one model of an end of the chapter test or end of the year test. You could also have students participate in book clubs or literature circles. This is much more conducive for our English and social studies, but there are also students who like nonfiction. So for your science and math, are there mathematical books, or are there books around science where they can discuss scientific concepts or mathematical concepts just as easy as a book club that is around fiction or narrative writing or history. Also, you can use student-directed discussion groups. So when you are teaching a section where you've introduced the concept, modeled it with the students, and then give students the option of, okay, we've finished with this chapter, you're going to lead a discussion about the group for this chapter. What are the questions that you could use to help students get a better sense of what the significance of this date, this time, this concept is? Also, in speaking with the students, you really need to understand their different comprehension and language development. Many of you are working with adults in bilingual education. Having an assessment of what they know and understand, as well as introducing the new words or letters embedded in the literature as well as embedded in the conversation, will help the students better understand what it is that you're trying to help them learn. In all of this work, you are developing relationships with and among your students. So relationships, researchers have documented how relationships with adults and other institutional players such as administrators, guidance counselors, nurses, social workers, and their friends matter for immigrant and other minority students. They come from communities where they lack the familiarity with the U.S. school system, lack the familiarity with U.S. history or U.S. Culture, and so they go towards these adults and these peers and friends to help explain what is it. These peers, anyone who is an adult who cares about the students, is willing to really bridge these sort of disconnect for them, really translate the cultural norms and what are the problems and issues. Michael Sadowski talked about how students really help each other, the peer-to-peer network. And so there is bad peer influence that we hear all about, but there's also good peer influences where they check up on each other. And so how do you capitalize on that in your classroom? So think about your classroom and think about, how do I develop relationships with my students? And if you're the administrators, how do you develop relationships with your staff? And then also think about, how do you encourage your students or staff to develop relationships with each other? So are there activities that you do throughout the day, throughout the lesson, that help students share a bit about yourself? For example, when you're breaking students up, instead of using regular, let's count to 1, 2, 3, 4, you can say something like, can I have you, all the firstborns, group together, the secondborns, thirdborn, anyone who is born in the month of July. Like, those are informations about each of the students that they haven't shared, but that you use as part of your grouping. Likewise with staff, if you're having faculty meetings, you can group people, because usually, you know, us teachers, we go sit with our colleagues, but then you can say, group people who have gone outside the country, group people together who experience, who like roller coasters, like anything, information about yourself that could help people connect to one another to form a sense of community. And likewise with yourself, what are the parts of your identity that you share with your students and staff? Are you just learning about other people and not sharing? I've had students who talk about how these are the first time that they have met white Irish Catholic or Greek or Italian, because in their lives all they are surrounded by are Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, Vietnamese, and so you are that culture broker for them. So share your life and your understanding and culture with these students as much as possible. So, as I was saying, instructional strategies to develop relationships, learn about the student's culture, have them share artifacts that reflect their culture, have them write about it, and talk about the traditions that are shared by their families. And then for students, some students, have them research different aspects of their culture. Because for me, as a Lao student growing up in the United States, I knew nothing about the U.S. Lao history, but had a teacher told me to go research it, then I could learn it even though that was not part of the U.S. history content. So as you're looking to develop these relationships, you're really looking to build a community. The students really, you heard that one Chinese boy say that, I feel lonely, right, even when I'm with a sense of community. So you need to really think about, what does community look and feel like in my classroom? What am I doing? What are my students doing individually, collectively? And how do we develop a class culture that accepts and appreciates differences? So not all the English language learners are lumped together, or not all the students from Charlestown or Dorchester or wherever the neighborhoods. Like, how do you really build a community where students feel comfortable interacting with each other, asking questions about each other, and not necessarily teasing people? And that was one of the largest things that came out in my own research, but also in these students' voices. So, in order to help build community, you need to utilize various resources that are available to you and that are available in the students' communities. Have community members come and speak on various topics. You could ask them to come teach a lesson or give a demonstration or show an alternative ways of learning, that math that was taught differently, or science examples from Lithuania or Armenia. These are the type of things that you can do to help the students really connect with what you're learning and also see that their culture and community members are being valued. So I'm going to end with one example of how I did this work with the middle and high school students. So as I mentioned, I'm a refugee from Laos, and I came here in the United States in 1979, but I grew up in the United States and I never learned about the secret war on Laos. And so for me, I had to learn this from a nonprofit agency. But as a teacher, I'm like, how can I make these connections to the classroom? And so what ended up happening was I created a curriculum that was a 5-week curriculum that focused on arts, advocacy, and education. And so there are some students that you will need to know what is their background, what is the political, social background of those communities. You research that, and then you make those connections. The Common Core standards are telling you that you need college and career readiness skills for people. So they need to be able to read, write, speak, and perform in this 20th century. And so with your learning, how can we incorporate reading, writing, speaking, and performing, and the other forms of arts? And so this curriculum was done in Seattle, in a high school in Seattle, where we actually had students learn about the bombings in Laos. We had them actually interview other veterans who were Vietnam veterans, and not only people who were in Laos, but from also the Korean War and the World War I's, World War II's. So they were actually articulating as they're learning about war and peace and conflict, and then mapping it out on the different people in their lives. They also had them creating exhibits about what is the effect of war and how can we show what we learn through an artistic rendition. The interviews themselves are recording of oral history. The art, we had students who also did a mapping. You notice the red areas on here is the bombs that are still left over 40 years from now, and so they wrote math problem-solving questions. They also had, and then shared that with the math teacher, how you can use whatever it is that you know in one class and then bring it over to another class. So that was just learning about the students, learning about their background, researching the resources. There are plenty of resources on the web. And so what we want you to be able to do is first get to know yourself, get to know the students, and then make those connections much more alive for them. And then let them show you multiple ways that they've learned your content. In doing so, you're validating their identity, you're validating their community, and you're really making learning meaningful for them. And that's what is the purpose of bringing students' lives and connecting them to what you do as a teacher. So hopefully I've whet your appetite for more learning and thinking about where and how you can make changes to your curriculum and how that would connect to the immigrant students in your classroom. And also really thinking about what activities you can integrate to create a culture of sharing around ethnic identity and building a class culture. You are now moving to your small group assignments. Have a productive conversation, and I hope to see you on day 3. On day 3, we're going to have an exciting session of live action planning where you will collaborate with other educators. I brought a person who would like to see you on day 3 as well. And so we're going to collaborate with all the K-12 educators, adult basic educators, as well as administrators. So come with ideas that you want to incorporate into your classroom, and also we'll provide you with new strategies as well as ideas. So join us.